Well, welcome. I want to thank you for joining me once again for another walk through Scripture. The Scriptures have guided God's people for generations, bearing faithful witness to His faithfulness as most clearly revealed in His Son, Jesus Christ, and they're still steady enough to continue guiding us today. And so we're going to take a nice, calm, unhurried walk through a passage today that continues some of the previous walks that we've been on. So I invite you, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, grab your Bible, take a deep breath, and let's begin our walk through Exodus chapter 14. We'll be in verses 10 through 14. Now, as we get started, and we're turning to those verses, let's take a moment to kind of get our bearings here. So this first part of Exodus 14, really, there's two scenes going on at this point in time. So in verses 5 through 9, we have a scene with Pharaoh and the Egyptian leaders, the Egyptian officials, and they've changed their mind about letting Israel go, and they say, back up in verse 5, what have we done? We have released Israel from serving us. So there's a very clear idea here that there's going to be some economic impact to this, which there would be, and quite possibly political and social as well. So they're sitting there just really wondering what it is that they did. Well, as the Net Bible puts, what in the world have we done? And so they're changing their mind. And so they gather together this elite force and they set out in pursuit of the Israelites. And so then we pick up in verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians coming after them. The Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord for help. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand firm and see the Lord's salvation that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you must be quiet." There are many times in life where fear strikes. And this is definitely one of those times for the Israelites. Fear struck. There's some things that are rather interesting, some details that I think are worth just kind of taking a look at. The first one is rather humorous, to me anyway. In verse 10, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians coming after them. There is a sense of surprise in this. There is a sense in which it would appear that the Israelite people did not expect this. Now, there's a few different possibilities here as to why they would not be expecting this. One is, well, maybe they just didn't believe that the Egyptians would come after them. Second is, maybe they thought that they'd be ready for the Egyptians, and when they looked up and saw them, all of a sudden they were overwhelmed and said, "Nope, changed our minds here." But another interesting possibility, which kind of has some credibility with me anyway, is that in the very first 4 verses of chapter 14, God speaks to Moses, and this is where it all gets set up, right? So, God leads them out at the end of chapter 13 of Egypt, and he takes them not the quick and easy road that's nearby. And the reason is because God says that they may see warfare and change their minds and return to Egypt. So there's this idea that they will turn back on their own, give up on the entire thing, and never reach the promised land. And so there is that hanging over all of this, which is very interesting. Okay, we'll get back to that here in a minute, I think. But then in chapter 14, God spoke to Moses and laid out for him and tells him to tell the Israelites to turn back, tells them where to go, and says I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart and he will pursue you. Maybe, speculation, you understand, but I think it's reasonable. Maybe Moses left that part out when he was talking with the people. Maybe he left out the fact that Pharaoh's going to be coming after us. Maybe it's because when it says in chapter 13, verse 17, that God said the people will change their minds and return to Egypt if they face war. Maybe when it says God said that, it doesn't really say, but maybe he was speaking to Moses. Maybe this is something that Moses knew. Maybe this is something that Moses recognized. And he knew that, well, if I tell the people we're turning back, and this is God's plan, is that Pharaoh's going to see us wandering around, and God's going to harden Pharaoh's heart, and he's going to come after us. If I tell him that, there's going to be panic, pandemonium, and maybe the people aren't going to follow God's plan. They're not going to do what God says out of fear. And so maybe he kept it to himself. I think it's a reasonable speculation. Maybe they're surprised because they didn't know this was coming. Either way, it really seems they did not expect this. One way or the other, this was some sort of surprise for them, and they react in fear. Now, there are two things that happen because of that fear here in these verses. The first one is very positive, actually. Fear is a catalyst to faith, because it says that the Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord for help. That's not presented in a bad light. Oftentimes, we think of fear as a bad thing. Fear can be a very good thing. Fear tells you something's wrong. Fear tells you when danger is near. Fear tells you when something might come at some sort of risk. So fear can be a good thing. And that kind of fear can be a catalyst that drives people to prayer. And it did for the Israelites here initially. However, that initial prayer seems to have been they prayed to God, but then they immediately jumped to this next part, if you will, the next level of fear. They didn't surrender the fear, and they didn't just let fear inform them of the danger that was approaching, because let's face it, the elite of the Egyptian army was coming at them. Verses 5 through 9, when it talks about the 600 chariots, the hand-picked ones, and then the officers that were in them, probably handpicked by Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh put together an elite force, and the Egyptian army was an elite force to be reckoned with in that time. So, and you're a bunch of laborers, and you turn around and you see the world's most elite military coming right for you, and you know it's you they're coming for. I think it's reasonable to have a little bit of fear. I think that's a healthy dose of fear. But they didn't just let that be a catalyst to faith. It's like they had a moment of faith, but then it immediately turns into faithlessness. In other words, they like lose their faith. They lose their confidence in God. They lose their confidence in God's chosen leader, Moses, and they complain to Moses. They say to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt?" Which is kind of humorous because, I mean, there are plenty of graves in Egypt. As a matter of fact, Egypt is known for some of its graves. The Great Pyramids, for example, would be kind of like a rather striking emblem of graves are quite plentiful in Egypt. And they were. So they're kind of being a little ironic, sarcastic, perhaps. Either way, they're terrified, and they're like, "Is it because we couldn't die back there? You brought us out here to die. There wasn't room to bury us in Egypt, or what is the deal, man? Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness?" I mean, they're convinced they're going to die, and then they say, "What have you done to us? What have you done?" Kind of reminiscent of the Egyptians and Pharaoh back in verse 5 when they say, "What have we done? What have we done?" They changed their minds. Now the people look to Moses and in a much more accusatory manner go, "What have you done?" Now they're changing their minds about following this plan. They're changing their minds. And though here they don't state it because they're afraid they're going to die, it's very clear they would rather be back in Egypt. They would rather go. As a matter of fact, if the option presented itself right here, right now, they would gladly take the opportunity to go right back to where they started. Go back to bondage in Egypt. The fear erased the joy of this journey. It erased the joy of escaping bondage and the joy of freedom. And they would rather live in bondage than, in their perspective, die on the road to freedom. And so they're upset. They're terrified. This fear that initially caused them to cry out to God pushed even further. So they're going from fear informing them of a danger to fear guiding them. And fear isn't a good guide. Fear is a terrible guide. And Moses tells them, "Do not be afraid." And I don't think, and this is personal speculation again, I don't think he's saying don't feel the healthy fear of this is a dangerous situation. I think he wants them to recognize, yes, this is a dangerous situation. But don't let fear override your faith. Let fear catalyze you to a deeper faith. Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the Lord's salvation that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you must be quiet. Well, we'll pause on the trail there for today.